By the way, I need to go back and confirm this, but I think I may have been wrong about who wrote that last chapter 6. It may have actually been Richard Carrier. I thought it was Jay Lauder. Jay Lauder actually wrote chapter 7 and maybe another chapter, but by the way, I would highly recommend the book for the other chapters. I'm just trying to deal with I'm trying to stick with chapters that are basically commenting on a theme that has to do with the esoteric way that these early resurrection texts are being dealt with. And so that's why I'm not covering the chapters that argue with contemporary Christian apologists like William Lane Craig's historical evidence or historical arguments for the resurrection. There are chapters in here that cover that respond to William Lane Craig and do an excellent job of doing so. Where they comment on other alternative explanations for what happened to the body of Jesus, which they find more plausible than the idea that he rose from the dead physically. And of course, that's not the only option. There's also other views out there as well. That, for example, that Christ didn't actually die. There was a view, that he was a revolutionary and he wasn't arrested and condemned and crucified for anything having to do with theology, but rather for political reasons, that he was actually, that he actually started a mystery school in order to recruit followers to help him overthrow the authorities. That might sound ridiculous to some who've never heard of this before, but why did it take 600 Roman soldiers to go arrest one man if they didn't think he was a threat, right? And some people think that some of his followers, held up that sponge. That sponge contained something that essentially knocked him out and would have made it appear that he had died. So they were able to convince the Romans not to break his legs. They pulled him down from the cross and they took him and they utilized bombs to bring him back. So there's a lot of different explanations. I'm not going to tell you right now what I find to be the most plausible, because I'm going to save that for a future topic that's part of a larger issue that I want to cover. Which I think you're going to enjoy. It has to do actually with the Old Testament, a very prominent Old Testament theme related to the Nephilim, the giants of Genesis 6, the Elohim, and the Anunnaki. But for now, we are continuing with chapter 9. Written by Richard Carrier, the same author who wrote the essay for chapter 5. And I'm actually not reading the first half of the chapter because, again, it's more historical responses to William Lane Craig. He's trying to say that he's not taking the position that the body was the subject of theft. He's just saying it's a more plausible explanation than William Lane Craig. So he's interacting with Craig in the first half. But I'm skipping that because what I'm interested in is this last part where he shows how Matthew is utilizing Daniel to tell his story. And it says a lot. So he uses this dispute he's having with William Lane Craig about the text saying that guards were set over the tomb, right? To set over the stone that was rolled across the tomb. That's the background for this next section. Daniel in the lion's den. So I'm going to read that to the end of the chapter. So we have 3 good reasons to doubt there were guards at the tomb of Jesus. But there is a 4th reason that clinches the case. And like the others, it further supports the hypothesis that the story is a deliberate fiction. The entire story of the guards links the tomb of Jesus with Daniel in the lion's den, a popular symbol of resurrection and of Jesus among early Christians. When Daniel was entombed with the lions, and thus facing certain death, King Darius placed a seal on the stone, quote, so that nothing might be changed in regard to Daniel, Daniel 6:17, exactly the same purpose of the Jews in Matthew. In Matthew, the placing of the seal is described with the very same verb used in the Septuagint version of the Daniel story, sphragizo. Thus, Jesus, facing real death and sealed in the den like Daniel, would, like Daniel, escape death by divine miracle, defying the seals of man. The parallels are too dense to be accidental. Like the women who visit the tomb of Jesus, the king visits the tomb of Daniel at the break of dawn, 6:19. The escape of Jesus signified eternal life, and Daniel at the same dramatic moment wished the king eternal life, Daniel 6:21 and 6:26. In both stories, an angel performs the key miracle, Matthew 28:2, Daniel 6:22. After this miracle, the guards curiously become, quote, like dead men, just as Daniel's accusers are thrown to the lions and killed, 6:24. The odd choice of the phrase like dead men thus becomes explicable as an allusion to these victims. The angel's description is also a clue to the Danielic parallel. In the Septuagint version of Daniel 7:14, an angel is described as kai to enduma autu, I don't know if I'm reading this right, hoise shion lukon, and his garment was white as if snow. In Matthew 28:3, the angel is described the same way, and his garment was white as snow. Every word identical but one, and that a cognate, and every word but one in the same order. Another angel in Daniel 10:6 is described, I'm not going to say the Greek this time, quote, his outward appearance was as if a vision of lightning, end quote, while the angel in Matthew is similar. His appearance was as lightning. The imagery is clearly a Danielic marker. Further, Matthew alone among the Gospels ends his story with a particular commission from Jesus, 28:18 through 20, that matches many details of the ending of the Septuagint version of Daniel's adventure in the den. God's power extends in heaven and on earth to go and make disciples of all nations and teach them to observe the Lord's commands, for Jesus is with them, quote, always, even unto the end. And so King Darius, after the rescue of Daniel, sends forth a decree, quote, to all nations, commanding reverence for God who lives and reigns, quote, always, and even, quote, unto the end, with power in heaven and on earth, Daniel 6:25-28. The Greek phrase here is even identical in both cases. The stories thus have nearly identical endings. Indeed, the king's decree in Daniel reads like a model for the gospel itself. This is Daniel 6:25-27. Then King Darius wrote unto all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. And his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivereth and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. End quote. In fact, the episodes are framed the same. In both Matthew and the Septuagint text of Daniel, the stories have in their first verse the verb to seal, and in their last the noun age or eon. Daniel says, O king, live through all ages. Darius decrees, he is the living God through all ages. Jesus says, I am with you through all days unto the end of the age. Equally crucial is the fact that in the earliest Christian artwork, Daniel was associated with the Persian Magi. Of course, the whole story of Daniel takes place in Persia, and the book of Daniel is the only book in the whole Bible to mention Magi, except Matthew, who alone among the evangelists depicts Magi visiting the Christ at birth, 2:1-12. It seems like an unlikely coincidence. It makes perfect sense that Matthew, who intends to close his gospel with a Danielic parallel, should introduce his gospel with an allusion to the context of Daniel, linking Jesus with him both in birth and in death, as well as resurrection. And this further confirms Matthew's intent to turn the tomb of Jesus into the lion's den of Daniel. Since the placing of a seal is essential to creating the Danielic parallel, Matthew has a motive for inventing the entire motif of the guards in order to create the pretext not only for the sealing, but for the clue of, quote, becoming like dead men and the angelic, quote unquote, miracle. Since Matthew alone mentions guards, while the other Gospels contradict such an idea, and Matthew alone uses a Danielic motif in the beginning and end of his Gospel, invention of the guards is the best explanation of all the facts at hand. Matthew may have also seen the advantage his story held as an apologetic answer to accusations of theft, and so used it to a double purpose. Indeed, possibly a triple purpose, since the guard placing account involves the Sanhedrin both holding a meeting and placing a seal on a tomb on the Sabbath, a Passover Sabbath no less, two actions prohibited by Jewish law. Thus Matthew shows them violating the Sabbath to try and thwart the good news, a deliberate contrast with the synoptic report that they attacked Jesus for violating the Sabbath to do good instead, 12:1-14. In support of this contrast being intended, of the four Gospels, Matthew alone emphasizes this theme of doing good on the Sabbath by putting all Sabbath-related stories into one event in chapter 12, which Mark, Luke, and John spread out into two or more events, and by omitting reference to the Sabbath in Jesus' travels everywhere else except here and in the Passion narrative, suggesting a relationship between the two. Likewise, Matthew, more than any other, builds a consistent contrast between hypocrisy and discipleship. So the opportunity to turn his Danielic parallel into an apologetic coup, as well as an attack on Jewish hypocrisy, probably molded the form of the story we have. Molded the precise form of the story we have. This explains the otherwise strange fact that Matthew has the guard placed on Saturday rather than Friday. It also explains his peculiar use of the day after the preparation instead of, quote, the Sabbath. For Matthew's Jewish audience would certainly know what that means, that the Pharisees failed to make this particular preparation on the day of preparation, set aside by God for doing just that. In the end, all 6 of MacDonald's criteria for literary remodeling are met here. The text being imitated, the Septuagint, was well known and frequently used this way. The comparison of Jesus with Daniel was a common one. There are several significant parallels. The parallels appear in the same order. The connection is confirmed by peculiar features, direct borrowing of phrases, unusual description of the guards, and the whole device reveals an obvious, intelligible, and appropriate meaning. Indeed, the story becomes interpretable with obscure and seemingly confused features suddenly making perfect sense. As further support for the hypothesis of fiction of the 4 evangelists, Matthew appears to be the most willing to import the fabulous into his accounts. For example, there is the earthquake recorded nowhere else, even though it split rocks, 27:51. The horde of undead descending on Jerusalem, 27:52-53, and the fable concerning Herod and the killing of the babies, 2:16. A legendary motif attached to kings and great men for centuries before Jesus, from Oedipus and Cypselos of Corinth to Krishna, Moses, Sargon, Cyrus, Romulus, and others. Rather than argue for these as falsehoods here, it need only be observed that these are prima facie fantastical events with a legendary ring, which are absent from the other 3 gospel accounts and uncorroborated in any independent source despite their enormously public nature. Therefore, that Matthew is prone to fictionalizing events best explains the presence of all these unique elements, including his equally unique and incredible version of the empty tomb story. Contrary to this conclusion, Craig, meaning William Lane Craig, claims that there is evidence of a pre-Matthean tradition behind his guard story, but his evidence is far less persuasive. First, the reference to a tradition in 28:15 is precisely part of Matthew's apologetic aim, to invent a tale to counter the charge of theft, and to credit the Jews with evil doing, e.g. lying, bribery, and violating the Sabbath. It thus does not prove there was any real tradition of a guard, although someone before Matthew might already have invented guards as an apologetic response anyway. Second, the phrase chief priests and Pharisees is not unique to this story, but appears elsewhere verbatim in Matthew 21:45, as Craig himself admits, and these 2 groups are key to Matthew's story. It is the chief priests whom Herod consults after the visit by the Magi, 2:4, and it is the Pharisees who question Jesus about the Sabbath, 12:2, so there are the 2 groups who most symbolically frame the meaning of the tale of the guard. Third, the words Craig claims are hapax legomena for the New Testament are either nothing of the kind, or are explained by Matthew's unique story and employment of a Danielic parallel. None of this is unusual enough to suggest Matthew is borrowing these words from someone else. The word aporion appears in Mark 11:12 and repeatedly in John and Acts, and it is a commonplace in the Septuagint, whose language Matthew often uses. Then he mentions another word in Greek that I'm not going to try to pronounce. Appears in Mark 15:42, Luke 23:54, and John 19:14, and John 19:31. Its use here by Matthew underscores the fact that the Jews forewent the proper day of preparation when they ought to have made these arrangements and violated the Sabbath instead. And planos appears in John 7:12 and throughout the epistles in the Septuagint, while the verbal form is commonplace throughout the Gospels and in Matthew more than any other author. Its use here is obviously a deliberate irony, the deceivers who end the story with a grand deceit called "Call Christ a deceiver and the resurrection a deceit." The only words that are unique are custodia, guard, and asphalizo, to secure, which is not surprising since the story of a guard securing something is uniquely Matthew's, and of course sphragizo, which is a deliberate hallmark of the Danielic meaning of the text. The only conclusion left is that Craig is wrong. Theft of the body is plausible in both a general and a specific sense. In general, theft of a body, especially that of a crucified holy man, is the sort of thing that happened with some frequency at the time. In contrast, we cannot say the same about miraculous resurrections, but more specifically, theft cannot be ruled out in the case of Jesus, there being no good evidence against it, and plenty of means, motive, and opportunity for it. So theft not only remains a live option for explaining an empty tomb, but it is also more antecedently probable as an explanation than a miraculous resurrection. Of course, we cannot know whether the body of Jesus was stolen, since all direct evidence has been erased by secrecy and time, but there is little justification for resorting to a supernatural explanation. For we know too little about what actually happened that weekend in Jerusalem nearly 2,000 years ago, and we have no good evidence that any form of supernaturalism is true. To argue that the tomb was empty because Jesus was raised from the dead requires a lot of very reliable evidence that simply isn't available. All the evidence we have that could be said to support resurrection over theft is scanty and not very reliable, and even that can all be explained by other natural phenomena such as hallucination and legendary development. Therefore, not only does resurrection have a much lower antecedent probability than theft, but it is only weakly supported by specific evidence in the case of Jesus. I cannot explore here all the issues relevant to determining whether theft is actually more probable than a resurrection. I can only leave it to the reader to decide, given all the evidence presented above, whether the body was more likely stolen, or more importantly, whether we can confidently assert that it wasn't. That's the end of the chapter. I probably didn't need to read those last couple of paragraphs with his speculations about theft. It's certainly more plausible than a resurrection, given everything we've already seen, and certainly just in terms of, in general, theft is more probable than a miracle, right? But I'm not necessarily convinced that the theft argument is the way to go. There are other theories that do get mentioned and discussed in this book, and then I think there's another one in particular that I'm not sure if they get into here, but that I mentioned briefly when I began the video. But that's the end of chapter 9. Just that last part of chapter 9 I wanted to read to show the parallels between Matthew and Daniel, to show that Matthew is really telling a story. And then I may or may not do one last chapter. It's another chapter by Richard Carrier, chapter 10 in this book, The Burial of Jesus in Light of Jewish Law. That might be worth reading, even though it gets into a lot of the historical stuff that I said I really wasn't keen on covering right now. But that was a particularly, I think, effective essay. So I may but get into that, but possibly not.